are swamped out of the picture if you think about Pacific Island countries in relation to Asian countries. So, so the United Nations, especially the UN Development Program, recognizes Pacific Island countries as their own kind of sub-region in the world. Now, I like this map because this map helps to give an enlarged sense of the Pacific Islands. And by virtue of the Law of the Sea Convention in 1982, all countries that have a coastal border were awarded a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, what Americans would call the EEZs, or those of us from a British heritage would say EEZs. Yeah? And what that Law of the Sea Convention did was it basically, you know, exponentially increased our political territories. So islands that are very, very small could then extend their legal boundaries to 200 miles from their shore. So this map gives you a sense of what that does for some of our countries. And this is the sort of map that brings us more visibility. But as I pointed out, hopefully where's that? You know, there's some islands that are as small as 14. There's Pitcairn over there, with a population of 40. Niue, with a population of 1,200. Tuvalu, here, 10,000. Papua New Guinea, 7 million. That gives you a sense of some of the range and scale. I'll be talking about my research with women soldiers from Fiji. Here, Fiji has a population of under 900,000. But as I said, I wanted to highlight some of the issues that are concerning Pacific people. Many of you will know about climate change and how a lot of our islands are actually at the front line of the worst threats of climate change. Here you've got the Marshall Islands. These are low-lying coral islands south of the Marshall Islands, Kiribati. That TI makes an S sound, not a T sound, so it's not Kiribati, it's Kiribati. And further south from Kiribati, you've got Tuvalu, some other low-lying coral islands, Tokelau, the northern Cook Islands here are also under threat from climate change. And so you're getting unprecedented storm tidal surges, weather patterns that are also unprecedented, and you know, in spite of some of our politicians not wanting to admit it, a real likelihood that we'll be faced with some climate refugees. Currently, the UN definition for refugees does not allow for climate refugees. They just don't exist. But more and more people are finding their islands uninhabitable. We've had the first low-lying islands, the Carteret Islands in Papua New Guinea. They've had to relocate, and there are other small islands that have had to do so as well. Solomon Islands has seen some relocations of people. So climate change is a huge issue. And at a recent meeting of the Pacific Island Forum, civil society groups were kind of torn between whether they put all their energy in climate change or whether they addressed an issue that's long been festering in the Pacific, the issue of West Papua. So you see the biggest island in the Pacific is cut in half politically with this part in yellow being Papua New Guinea, an independent sovereign nation, but the other half of the island, who are effectively their cultural brothers and sisters, is politically part of Indonesia. And there's a quite shameful history of UN complicity in the colonization by Indonesia of West Papua. The Dutch, who had occupied this half of the island, were withdrawing, and it looked like West Papua would become independent, but Indonesia stepped in, and because West Papua has the world's largest gold mine and third largest copper mine, international sort of forces helped to make West Papuan independence not happen. So, so big issues in the Pacific and how these are related to gender. You know, one of the things we're seeing is, as Cynthia pointed out, is the way that sometimes women's issues or women's rights and human rights issues are kind of used as a guise to help enable the state and multinational corporations to claim land and resources in these developing countries. So what we're seeing as well is with the extraction of natural gas in this big island especially, and also minerals, forestries, and fisheries. We're seeing sometimes women's rights being used as a kind of front for dispossessing people of their lands. We'll help the women, you know, deal with family violence or with cultural and ritual violence, but before you know it, there's a mining company there and a road that helps take out your resources. So there's a very strong link in the Pacific between resource extraction and militarization, and I think we're going to see a lot more militarization in Papua New Guinea, and Papua New Guinea has a direct line to Fiji now, direct flights, and lots of cross investment that I think, you know, demand that we keep an eye on these sorts of things. So my research is on Fiji and women soldiers. For those of you who don't know, Fiji's experienced 4 coups between 1987 and 2006. 3 of them were led by the military. 1 was supported by rebel soldiers. Last year, Fiji had its first general election since the coup of 2006. And Fiji troops currently serve in the UN peacekeeping forces in the Sinai, Golan Heights, and Somalia. The Golan Heights, as the crisis in Syria has increased, the Golan Heights has become a real focus for the Fiji military to increase its numbers and commitments. Within a year, within 6 months of the first deployment in 2013, there were already 500 Fiji troops in the Golan Heights. And Bainimarama, the Prime Minister of Fiji, who was the former military commander, has said explicitly that he's keen to see an annual rotation of 1,000 Fijians in the Golan Heights. So the thing about Fiji is that it's not just the Fiji military forces that Fijians are able to serve in. Fiji's got a huge surplus of labor. So we graduate about 17,000 high school leavers a year for 2,000 jobs. Yeah, so that's a lot of people who can't find employment. So the military is growing, and militarized options are increasing, and the export of militarized labor has been one of the features we've been seeing in the 21st century. So Currently, Fiji citizens also serve in the British Army. They have been serving since 1998. This is important to understand that this is a post-independence phenomenon. Fiji is no longer a colony of Great Britain, so Britain is coming to recruit after independence. So for those of you who don't know, there's a kind of commonwealth of nations, yeah, that British colonialism created. And so people, countries which were former colonies of Great Britain become part of the Commonwealth, or they can choose to be part of the Commonwealth, and you get some economic benefits from that. And so Fiji citizens are able to serve in the British Army as Commonwealth citizens. Through that service in the British Army, they've seen tours of duty in Northern Ireland, in Germany, in Cyprus, Kenya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And Iraq and Afghanistan have been really, really huge in the service experience of Fiji soldiers. So I started this research in 2008. My funding for the research ended in 2010. I was able to interview 20 women soldiers, but what emerged is that there were 3 generations of Fiji women who'd served. The working title of my book is Fiji Women Soldiers, 3 Generations, 2 Armies. The first generation of Fiji women to serve in a modern military was in 1961 in the British Army. The second generation came along in 1988 and were admitted to the Fiji Military Forces. And in the post-1998 era, Fiji women had the option of joining either the British Army or the Fiji military. So the Fiji military gave me permission to interview women soldiers and officers and anyone else I needed to. This was a surprise to me because it was under a military regime at the time, and I had thought they'd be a bit more closed, but they gave me free rein and I could go to any base and talk to anyone that I wanted. The only thing was that whenever I asked to see the archives, they politely distracted me with an afternoon tea. The British Army, on the other hand, which I had expected would give me an easy pass and let me interview Fijians in the service, did not give me permission. They explicitly said that my interest in history was of no interest to them, and that if I had been investigating something like a social problem, like alcoholism or family violence in the military, maybe they would have agreed. And I thought about changing my proposal, but I couldn't kind of retrain myself that quickly. So what I ended up doing was having to chase women in the, who'd served in the British Army who'd demobilized. And that was quite challenging. So for the post-1998 cohorts of women, I've also had to rely on media, and luckily there's been more media about them. But one of the things I wanted to highlight was that Pacific history is a small field that's been dominated by outsiders, mainly white men, and is still a very underdeveloped field when it comes to women. There are 2 monographs which look at women's history in Fiji. One looks at a history of white women, and the other looks at a history of Fiji women activists. So it's been really, really difficult to kind of do this research when so much primary research on women still hasn't been done. So, and that's not including the military history. So there are some historiographical pressures, constraints, and imperatives. And one of the constraints and imperatives comes from the field of military history itself. And there's a real tendency, a strong kind of tradition within military history to heroize soldiers and officers as well as men of other ranks. And these are three of Fiji's great military heroes. One from World War I, Ratu Solala Sukuna, who's also a high chief and considered the architect of modern Fiji. He, in World War I, was not able to serve because the British had a kind of racialized policy and they didn't want native men carrying arms. So he ended up serving in the French Foreign Legion and was awarded the Croix de Guerre from France. The second military hero is from World War II, Sefania Sukanaivalu, who was awarded the Victoria Cross, Great Britain's highest military honor, posthumously for his service in the Solomon Islands under an attack from Japan. And the third, this is a statue that I visited at Hereford at the SAS camp in Hereford. This is a place that is very much heroized. And this is a statue of Talayasi Lambalamba, a Fijian member of the SAS who died in Mirbat in Oman in 1972. He only received a mention in dispatches, but there's a ongoing campaign to try to get him awarded a Victoria Cross. And he's the only man of color with a statue at Hereford, or that we know of in any British Army camp. Yeah. So Fiji has a lot to be proud of, according to military historians. And this is the kind of rub. This is what I'm kind of working within and against, because from a historiographical perspective, that's my background in history. One of the debates, or one of the tensions that we're constantly negotiating, especially as indigenous historians, is this is the tension between history with a capital H and history with a small h. History that presents itself as truth, and history that invites questions and ongoing dialogue and conversation. And a historian named Greg Denning has written influentially about this. So this is having this kind of heroic history in the background is it has kind of forced me to think about how to write women's history in the military differently. And I have a whole kind of rift that I was going to read, but I'm keeping an eye on time, and so I'll just move quickly through some of these cohorts. So in the book, I'm looking at, as I said, 3 generations of Fiji women soldiers. This is an image from the 1961 cohort. This is when the women were about to leave Fiji at Nadi Airport to take off on this big adventure. Most of them were 18, 19. I think the oldest was 20. It was a very multicultural group of women. There were indigenous women, part European women. Fiji had this category of women called part European. And then there was one part Indian woman here, Vicky. So there were 12 women who enlisted for the British Army, but when they got to England, only 11 of them were able to go through basic training. And part of what I'm exploring in this idea of an anti-heroic history is the idea that a hero is made out of sacrifice and death, and kind of comes out of the Western literary tradition of the tragedy, and an anti-hero conversely comes out of a tradition that is life-affirming. It comes out of the comedy as opposed to the tragedy. I'm not totally beholden in my writing to this Western literary model, but it's helpful to think about heroism or the lack thereof. And so when 12 started out and only 11 ended up in basic training, the reason that one dropped out was because it was discovered that she was pregnant. And so she could not enter basic training, and she was quickly married off to the father of the child, who happened to be another British Army soldier from Fiji. And so 11 women continued. Now, when they left Fiji as a group, there was much fanfare, there was a lot of media attention, but when they finished their terms in 1964, they all came home quietly, even though 3 of the women had attained the rank of sergeant, which was quite remarkable for women from Fiji to become sergeants in the British Army, which technically was the Women's Royal Army Corps at the time. They had faced a lot of racism. People didn't know where Fiji was, even though Fiji was a British colony. They were surprised the Fiji women could speak English. The Fiji women were like, you colonized us. How would we not speak English? In this story, that I want us to just keep in mind that one woman couldn't continue in the service because she was pregnant. So one of the women who became a sergeant, Betty Foster, I thought it would be useful to show some of what she was up against and how it becomes really difficult. There are some structural things involved which kind of prevent the Fiji women from attaining a heroic status. So even though Betty was one of the most hard-working women of the 11, she would study at night under a torch. She had the least education of all of them, but she worked really hard and became a sergeant. One of the things that the British kept demanding of Betty was performance as a hula girl. So if you remember in the early 1960s, you know, Hawaii has just become a state, and the culture of hula was exploding thanks to you know, Elvis and all these guys. So so there was this constant demand for Betty to perform as a hula girl. And the thing is, she was a hula girl. She knew how to hula. She knew how to dance, and so she'd perform it. But that kind of, you know, erased and marginalized the really hard work she was putting in as a soldier. She talks quite poignantly about you know, her achievements and her kind of regrets in relation to not being able to continue in the service. And the Fiji women were only offered a 3-year contract. The men had been offered a minimum of 6 years to 22 years. But the women were only offered 3 years, and then they were sent home. So the history of this cohort is not well known, and a lot of the women didn't even talk about it with their family even though it was one of the most important experiences of their lives. So it wasn't until 1988 that the Fiji military itself allowed women to join. This woman, Carolina Vunibaka, was a classmate of mine. We went through school together, and here she is showing a picture of her cohort, the first women, the pioneer women in the Fiji military. When the women joined, a lot of them had great expectations. They were really excited to join the military, but then were very disappointed when they were given desk jobs. And one woman explicitly talks about how she had joined the military in order to drive a big truck, and she did not understand why she was sitting behind a desk, because she could do that as a civilian. So a lot of expectations weren't met for the first Fiji military cohort, and some women, after a few years of service, were even more frustrated when they weren't sent to peacekeeping, on peacekeeping duties. So some of them left, and there's an interesting kind of conjunction of options for the women. Some of the women kept saying, well, I would either become a flight attendant or I'd join the army. And both offered, well, one offered the world and the other one clearly didn't, and that was the military. Until 1995, when the first Fiji women soldiers were, and there were only 2, were deployed to the Sinai. And so the first women peacekeepers were sent off in 1995, and I want to follow this particular woman, Amelia Tandulala, who then becomes quite a key figure in the mutiny, the first mutiny that Fiji faced in 2000. Most of the coups before this, the 3 coups before this, the 2 coups before this had been termed bloodless coups, but in 2000 there were the violence was more pronounced. And in the footage of this December 2000 coup, Amelia Tandulala appears prominently because she got injured during the exchange of fire. Now, part of the anti-heroism that I'm thinking through, as I said, has to do with this notion of the anti-hero as affirming life, but also has to do with the anti-hero as kind of critiquing heroism, yeah? And the case of Amelia Tandulala is really interesting. She's an officer. And the women in the 1988 cohort were specifically recruited for officer service because the military thought that would be an easier way to integrate women. You give them rank, and therefore the men below them have to listen to them. Yeah? So that was astute in some ways. And Amelia Tandulala is a very strong figure. And in her interviews, she does talk about enjoying the power of ordering men around. So during the mutiny, she says she heard the exchange of fire, and so she looked out the window and got hurt. So she wasn't struck by bullets, but she was hurt by shrapnel. Now, other military personnel have said this is a very uncharacteristic thing for a soldier to do. When you hear fire, you are not trained to look out the window to see what's going on. You're supposed to take cover. That's what you're trained to do. And Amelia explicitly talks about how, in that moment, what she wanted to do was tell whoever was shooting off. Yeah? and that it was her role as a mother that kicked in rather than her training as a soldier. And so soon after the mutiny, she takes her son to one of the ubiquitous, what do you call them, studios, photographic studios, to take this photograph. And for me, it's such a striking photograph because she's wearing a sleeveless dress, and she's smiling broadly. Her son looks utterly confused. But what's really, really, you know, hard to miss are her injuries. And for me, in this case, her anti-heroism is very interesting because it's, as I said, it's an affirmation of life, but it's also, in some ways, it's precisely what a hero wouldn't do, yeah, especially a military hero. With the post-1998 cohorts, as I've said, you know, for anyone after 1998 from Fiji, you had the option of joining the British Army or the Fiji military. I can talk more about how the British Army has kind of changed some of the terms of their recruitment. But one of the biggest cases, you know, when Fiji women have hit the international headlines, came in 2012 when a young woman named Lynette Pierce gave birth at Camp Bastion in Helmand province in Afghanistan while serving with the British Army. And Camp Bastion at the time had just been attacked by the Taliban, and she'd been engaged in the exchange of fire, and 4 days later she was rushed into Camp Bastion's sort of medic tent complaining of stomach cramps, and it turns out she was pregnant and had a baby. And this is history for the British Army. There has never been a woman who's given birth on the front line in British Army history. And that woman was from Fiji, Lynette Pierce. Now, again, this is, you know, there's nothing more life-affirming, it would seem, than giving birth, right? And giving birth at the front line. But what's kind of challenged the way people understand Fiji military's kind of the Fijians' military reputation has been that Helmand was also the site of many losses of Fijian lives. So between 2003, by 2012, several Fiji men had died in Helmand province, and Lynette Pierce's father is quoted in some news stories as saying that they are ashamed of her, that she is an embarrassment, because instead of kind of contributing to that great military legacy, she went and had a baby at while in service. So these are some of the kind of things that I'm tracing amongst Fiji in the history of Fiji women's service. I wanted to end with quotes from Enlow and Cohen. Cynthia writes, "One need not necessarily admire every woman whose life one finds interesting. Feminist attentiveness to all sorts of women is not derived from hero worship." And in relation to what I'm trying to do with the history with a big H versus history with a small h, or a plural history, I take from the work of Carol's that the work that introduced me to Carol, Our reconstructive task is a task of creating compelling alternative visions of possible futures, a task of creating rich and alternative voices, diverse voices whose conversation with each other will invent those futures. So wanted to thank you, and I'm sorry for going over time. So, Minaka. Happy to have discussion and answer questions.
Teresia and I have these conversations, so I'm always curious about what she thinks. Teresia, oh, my name's Cynthia Enlow. Teresia, what was the stereotype, or has it changed, stereotype of, quote, the Fijian soldier amongst the British, or particularly the British military? What's that stereotype? I have a kind of guess, but I bet I'm not quite right. And then, what has been the stereotype that's probably newer of what a Fijian woman is? What's a Fijian woman stereotypically in British collective thinking?
Okay.
Both those. I'm just really curious.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. So there's a huge legacy that's come from both World War I, World War II, the Malaya campaign, right? Fijians served in the British anti-communist campaign in Malaya. And so that's kind of created a huge reputation for Fijians, and really is what kind of sold Fijians as a reliable force for UN peacekeeping, and then, you know, later for the British to come back and recruit. So Fijians have you know, been seen as a kind of martial race. And Paul Hagate writes about this, and that affects how Fijians are seen also in the private security industry, right?
So much like the Gurkhas.
Like the Gurkhas, yeah. So this kind of noble race of fearless warriors, right? But you know, so that's one reputation. But by the same token, sort of the flip side of that, when they're kind of out of uniform, and I remember meeting, you know, an Egyptian in the Netherlands once, and he says, "Oh, you're from Fiji," and he said, "You know, Fiji peacekeepers, Sinai, yes. Fiji, Fiji soldiers good, Fiji soldiers good. Fiji drink, Fiji bad." So there's this, you know, the flip side is that they have a very bad reputation, especially around alcohol. And I never saw this. I didn't travel to Germany for any of this research, but there are a lot of Fijians serving in the British Army in Germany. And apparently there are signs that say no Fijians on nightclubs. So you know, it's the stereotype is double-edged. Now, you know, I'm not sure there's a single stereotype of Fijian woman, because Fiji has a kind of caste society, and so, you know, there's Fijian chiefly women, and they have a certain kind of image, and ordinary Fijian women, you know, most people would say are friendly, helpful, love children, you know, good housekeepers, good carers. You know, there's this kind of sense that Fijians know how to serve and know how to be hospitable. And in fact, there are a lot of Fijian women in the care industry. That's a huge export for Fijian women's labor, is the care industry. So lots of Fiji women in California doing that kind of work. But in the military, my sense, especially in the British Army, is that Fiji women are considered exemplary. Yeah? They get stuff done. highly intelligent, like you just, you know, you couldn't ask. In fact, I did meet, you know, a warrant officer in the British Army who just said, you couldn't ask for a better soldier than a Fiji woman, yeah? But the image is that, you know, the other thing, you know, that all Fijians are really well prepared for military service. Yeah, they know how to put up with crap because they did that in their civilian life, and they're just hard workers. Yeah, so.
Thanks. That's so interesting.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Rajani Srikanth, and I want to apologize literally for coming at the tail end of your talk. So if you covered this earlier,
yeah,
you can just say, I covered it earlier. Okay. You know, but I am interested because, as you know, there's a complicated relationship between Fijians and Indians in Fiji, and I wondered if that extends into the military.
Yeah.
And, whether you could talk a little bit about
yeah,
that.
I didn't really talk about it. But I have written, I have a chapter in a publication called On Women and Indians, and the way that women and Indians kind of get included and excluded in the Fiji military kind of differentially. But, you know, the different histories have a lot to do with colonialism. And, but they also have to do with this kind of stereotype of indigenous Fijians as willing to serve, yeah? And it's ironic because when Fiji was, when Fiji became a colony, you know, the British proclaimed that they wanted to make this the best colony ever. This was going to be their kind of atonement for all the other, you know, colonial errors or mistakes that they'd made prior. So one of their solutions was that instead of degrading this noble people, they would bring their already degraded natives from India to do the work of making the colony productive, right? And so you had the period of indenture, and over 60,000 Indians brought to Fiji, and so Indians become the laboring class in Fiji, and the indigenous people become this kind of reified, noble, savage, who are actually disabled from entering the modern economy, right? They're kind of for their own good. So when World War I and World War II came around, you know, Indians being very politicized and understanding themselves as laborers were like, you want us to serve, you're going to pay us, and how much are you going to pay us? And if you have a graduated, racialized scale, we're not having anything to do with that. Whereas Fijians who've been shielded from money, right, and kind of encouraged to think about service as just a military service as a continuation of what they'd ordinarily give their own chiefs for free, you know, they didn't make those same demands. And so there's been a tension in, you know, amongst Fijians based on this idea that the Indians demanded equal pay and wouldn't serve, and we were willing to die for king and country, right? So Indian numbers in the military are very low, yeah? Like the military is 99.9% indigenous Fijian, yeah? There are Indo-Fijians who've served, and I've interviewed a couple of the women, but it's overwhelmingly an indigenous institution or organization. And that's part of the problem, because then it can get mobilized, or it did get mobilized in 3 coups on a racial basis. This coup, the 2006 coup, or the legacy of that is that now the military is on the side of democracy. It protects Indians, but it's still 99.9% indigenous. And no one's kind of held it to account for that. Yeah, but Indians actually don't want to go into the military. And the military is really starkly different from the police in Fiji, which is almost 50-50. Yeah? So Indians are happy to serve in the police force, but just won't go to the military. So it's not, and the police are paid worse than soldiers. I haven't done that research, but, you know, I think it has to do, in conversations I've had with friends and colleagues, I think it has to do with the nature of the institution and organization. And with the police, there's this kind of openness, right, where you're actually working with your community and you can see how you can help, right? Whereas the military, apart from maybe a few engineering projects, really all its work is overseas, yeah, on these peacekeeping missions. And for me, it's a fascinating question. I think somebody needs to do that research. And just, you know, now the Fiji military is quite well paid. Quite well paid. Before, they used to be on parity with the police, and yet you saw 50% Indians in the police. So clearly they weren't motivated by money, right? It's not about the money, it's about the kind of work. Yeah, so.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Heidi Gang. I'm on the faculty here in the history department.
Oh, hi.
And hi, and it was fascinating. Really, my field, very broadly speaking, is African history. So this is all very new to me, Fiji, Pacific Islands, and yet there's so many parallels.
Yes.
I have 1,000 questions, but I will ask 2. So the first, you mentioned early in your talk about, I think you're talking specifically about the 1961 cohort, that women had these, young Fijian women had these expectations for their, you know, either flight attendant or...
Oh, right. That was 88.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so the 88 cohort. So I was curious to know how thinking about, and you'd also mentioned this high rate of unemployment, of youth unemployment, as a kind of a push factor for young people looking at the military and serving as a job and as a career. So I'm wondering if you can say more about kind of gendered social expectations around military service. Because I'm also intrigued by the story about the woman who was pregnant and whose father was ashamed of her. Are there ways in which women's versus men's looking to the military as a career, how are those ideas different?
Great question. Yeah.
Since the early 60s? And then my second question comes much more from what I know and teach about in 20th century African history, about the ways in which African colonial soldiers sent abroad to serve in various colonial campaigns come back with very new ideas about their own identities, either in gender terms or racial terms, and how then those new ways of thinking about their position in a bigger world might lead to new kinds of social movements or new kinds of political discourses, whether it's nationalism or, in the Pacific Island case, a sense of kind of a trans-Islandic, picking up that word, just a new kind of, I don't know if it would, from what you were just saying, maybe it wouldn't be a kind of radicalism. It would be a more conservative way of thinking about identity. But the general question is sort of, what do they bring home, and how does that change political ideologies and political conversations?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Heidi, is this? Thank you. Really interesting question about gendered social expectations. for all the women I interviewed, there were, when their parents didn't support them joining the military, it was more for issues of control rather than because they were a woman or a girl. So one woman told me from 1961 that her mom publicly beat her, like, you know, smacked her around. But it's because she applied to join the military without asking her mom, and her mom heard about it from other people. And then her father stopped her mother, or, you know, and the father was happy, and they were like, go, go, you know. So none of the women I've talked to have had a family say, this is inappropriate for women, yeah? And in fact, my friend who I showed here, Carolina, she's a twin, and her father had been in the military, and she's a fraternal twin, so her twin is her brother. And her father had served in the military and had hopes that one of his sons would join the military. But after his military service, he had gone into forestry. And her twin brother followed the father into forestry, and she followed him into the military. And that wasn't expected, but it was very much supported by the family. So I was surprised that that gender didn't seem to be the issue, and there didn't. One of the I've got 3 historical chapters and 3 analytical chapters, and one of the analytical chapters is about the way that there's just this real absence of moralizing about women joining the military. There's moralizing about sex and getting pregnant, especially if you're not married, but there's no sense that just being a woman in a male-dominated profession or environment is somehow a threat to women's dignity or respectability. None of that comes through at all.
Because that sounds
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not kind of speculating about the whys of it. I'm just kind of recognizing the absence of it. So that's one thing. I'm not sure if I've fully answered your question about gendered social expectations, but then how ideas have changed. I don't think we understand this well enough, and because I focused on the women and the way the women kind of understood their experience, what I've seen is that most of the women they really see this as an economic opportunity, I think the women, my sense is, but I haven't done research with the men, but just the casual conversations I've had with the men, it just appears that there's a lot more going on with them about what this whole history means. The women enter this profession pragmatically, they do the job, they look after their families, and one of the things I've seen is it's very easy for them to stop being soldiers. They take off their uniform, no more. Yeah? Whereas the men, it seems like they're soldiers, whether they're in uniform or not. And because the men have a longer history of peacekeeping service, The women only started in 1995, and one of the things I didn't mention is that the women were only given 6 months tours of duty, and men had, 11 to 12-month tours of duty. And what that meant was that men earned more and had more chances of promotion because they got the medals. So for years, women were going, from 1995 onwards, women were going, serving 6 months and not getting any medals, because you have to serve the full term tour to get a medal. Yeah, so they had to lobby to have their terms extended, and so now men and women serve the same amount of time, but for a lot of Fijians, especially going to the Middle East and serving in the Sinai, and I don't know so much because the deployment to Syria is more recent, 2013, but going to Sinai is all about pilgrimage. Yeah, it's all about being able to see the landscape that you have studied since you were a child by reading the Bible. Yeah, so there's a lot of tourism that they do. Like, they're like, this is our chance to go to the Holy Land. And so it's kind of a reconfirmation rather than a challenging of ideas. I've always found that fascinating because, they come back, a lot of the soldiers come back quite convinced that the Israeli state is God's chosen, like they confuse the Israelites from the Bible with the Israeli state. And there's very little identifying with Palestinians as indigenous people, right? So there's there's lots of stuff going on. I'm not writing about this in this book. And it's quite complicated. Israel actually had an embassy in Fiji up until recently, a few years ago, and kind of nobody noticed. Now the embassy in Canberra takes Fiji as its is accredited to Fiji, but there's some complex stuff going on there. Although I have to admit that in the late 70s, no, when the Golan Heights were invaded, was it 77, 78? Fiji did speak out at the UN against it. So yeah, lots of interesting things going on there. But one of the men I talked to, he was asking me all these questions about the Pacific. What's Kiribati like? What's Samoa like? What's the rest of the Pacific like? And I was like, well, what, haven't you been to these places? And he goes, I've been going to the Middle East since I was 18, and he was in his 40s. And for him, Kurdish, coffee, the popular music of Egypt was more familiar to him than anything from other Pacific islands. So these men, they've been going there since 1978. They've been going to the Middle East, and so for 30 years, they've had this relationship with the Middle East that is stronger than any kind of sense of the Pacific that they have. So that deserves further research. And as I said, I found the women much more pragmatic. They were, all about the money, and they'd go and serve, and they'd take extra jobs while there. Right? So it wasn't just doing the peacekeeping, but is there extra work? I'll do it. I will earn as much as I can to send home, and remittances are huge. Yeah, So they've got this whole thing worked out of, you know, how much money they keep from their stipends to spend in the Middle East and what they send home, and how and who has access to what they send home, because they've learned lessons about, you know, having people just empty their bank accounts while they're away. But the women are very, very astute. They're buying land, they're, you know, investing, they're doing all sorts of things with the earnings. I have one friend who, you know, lived in a one-bedroom house. Her husband went away for one tour of duty. They extended, they got a second bedroom. Goes away for another tour of duty, they have a third bedroom. Goes away for another tour of duty, they have a second story. Yeah? So you can see the material benefits very clearly for them.
Malapito, Teresia Mokataki. I'm sorry I was late. I had a meeting I couldn't get out of. I was just addressing Tere in Tongan. This is the Pacific language that I speak, and I'm so happy to have you and hear your voice. And again, I missed most of this, but when you said Fijian women buy land, can they legally own land in Tonga? No. You have,
right.
So I'm really interested, because I think it might relate to your question, Heidi, about, to which the answer was no one says it's inappropriate for women to serve militarily. There have been Tongan and Samoan women who have been chiefs, who have ruled, who have been chiefs before their brothers were.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's the same in Fiji. So I wonder if there is not maybe a tradition of this sort of, at least in leadership positions and egalitarianism, that you may not necessarily find in the family unless you look at maybe the Vasu position with old elder sister, younger brother. I'm just really interested if there's some of these more day-to-day forms of egalitarianism that may be part of what's making it acceptable, highly acceptable for women. I just wonder.
Thanks, Malo Apito. Thank you, Pingi. You know, I sort of, there are women. There is a tradition of Fijian chiefly women, and but I'm not sure they're women. You know what I mean? Like, they're not, like, we see them as women, but when you're a chief, that trumps gender, right? It's not like you're a woman chief. When you are a chief and you sit with other chiefs who are men, you're all chiefs, and the highest ranking chief in Fiji now is a woman. And when people kind of reduce her to being a woman because she ran for election and lost to Bainimarama, and people say, oh, you know, she was too feminine or this or that, and it's like, you don't get it. She was being a chief. She wasn't being a woman. Yeah. So yeah, I feel like it's not. It doesn't help me to kind of to chiefly women don't help me understand Fiji women soldiers. And there's an indigenous, well, when Fijians talk about soldiers and women in the military, a woman of other ranks is called Yalewa Sortia. And so she's marked by her gender. Yalewa means girl or woman. And Sortia is the Fijianization of soldier. So you say Yalewa Sortia. But if she's an officer, you never mark her gender. She is a Turanga Nivalu, just like a man. All officers are Turanga Nivalu. That means they are lords of war. Yeah? So these two women, they were both officer rank when they went on peacekeeping in 1995. They were Turanga Nivalu. They were not Yalewa Sortia. They were not women. They were officers. So I wrote a poem where I talk about how a woman is, an officer is always a gentleman, even if he is even if she's a woman, right? Because women who are officers are not women officers. They're gentlemen. They're gentlemen of war or lords of war. Yeah, you never mark their gender in the Fijian language. So it's an interesting kind of interplay. At the same time, one of the things we've noticed, you know, through the three cohorts, and because the women from 1988 were recruited as officers, they were kind of, ironically, in an Anglo-centric way, they had to maintain a certain femininity, right? And then in the post-1998 cohorts, what you get is the Fiji military is like, okay, we're not, you know, these women pioneered, they opened the doors, now we don't have to worry about men treating women badly, we can recruit women into other ranks. And so the women who are recruited into other ranks don't have the pressure to be feminine, right? So you get these images of you know, soldiers who are female but don't have to, you know, they wear essentially the same uniforms as men. Yeah, there's no kind of marking of them, no need to mark them as female. So there's some interesting kind of inversions and subversions going on around gender. Yeah. Yeah. Carol.
Thank you so much. I also have about 15 questions, but I'll try to restrict myself. I wonder if, maybe to two, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the kinds of calculuses and logics that the women who join the military talk about their decisions. And then I wonder if you could tell us, are there different constructions of what service in the British military means versus in the Fijian military, and also whether that's related to the difference between peacekeeping and not, and are there constructions around peacekeeping? I mean, it's interesting you talk about, you know, service in Egypt as being about pilgrimage more than peacekeeping. So is there a kind of ideology or you know, constructions of what it means to be peacekeeping? So I think that was more than two. I'll stop.
Okay. Thank you. Right. So you know, for the women who were pioneers in 1961 and 1988, you know, a lot of them just kind of did it on a whim. Like, nobody grew up wanting to be a soldier. And they threw their names in. They got selected. They were like, okay, let's give it a go then. They all had something else going on. And that's also a difference between the men and the women. A lot of the men, because it's overwhelmingly male, a lot of the men, especially in other ranks, they didn't have to achieve education above 10th grade. Yeah? Whereas the women in 1988, when they were recruited, you had to finish high school. Most of them were at university. So they're coming from different positions already. Majority of the men aren't as educated as the women, although the officers and the women have the same sort of backgrounds. So when they decide to join, it's just like a gamble. But when peacekeeping is offered, everyone takes it, because of the economic gains, right? But as I said, also there's this idea that, well, this is your chance to go to the Holy Land. Now, in terms of how this compares to service in the British Army, again, with the women who go into the British Army post-1998, they have other options, but the British Army promises to take them outside of Fiji immediately, whereas with the Fiji military, it's kind of like you might have to serve for a bit before you'd get to go. Now, in the British Army, you can only ever be of other ranks because you are not a British citizen. You're a Commonwealth citizen, so you'll hit a ceiling, right? There's only so far that you can go. Unless you get British citizenship, you can't be an officer in the British Army. So, there are people who are in the same family. Some are in the British Army, some are in the Fiji military, and they have this rivalry, and and the Fiji military folks are like, you're serving, and it's not even your country, and they don't give you full rights, yeah? And then the British Army folks look at the Fiji military, and they go, but you're a banana republic, you guys have coups every so often, right? And of course, what they don't, and this is a huge blind spot for folks in the British Army. I mean, the British Army is constantly kind of, the Battle of Mirbat, the Oman the SAS is constantly undermining the sovereignty of other nations, yeah? So to kind of hold the British Army up as this kind of, guarantor of democracy, that's a fantasy, right? But people actually don't talk about that. So Fijians can serve in the British Army and think we're better because we don't have coups, yeah? That's some of the kind of calculus, I think, that people are making. People are thinking that, to earn the British pound is better than to earn the Fiji dollar. But the people who are earning the Fiji dollar also have a cost of living that is a Fiji cost of living. And the folks who are earning the British pound have to live in British cities and pay British rent and all of that. And the people who earn Fiji dollars, actually, when they go on peacekeeping, they earn American dollars, yeah? And that makes a huge difference when they bring that home. So those are some of the things that affect them. In terms of, peacekeeping, I remember when, Cynthia, I can't remember, was it the morning after, was writing about how peacekeeping kind of becomes this less heroic work, yeah, that militaries now have to do. But, when you combine that with the religious kind of dimension, that compensates, yeah? Peacekeeping is not heroic, but it allows you to do this other thing that's important to you, yeah? And that's all about religion. So yeah, that's some of what I see going on. I've heard people talking about when British Army guys especially come home for holidays, they get all, kind of have all this bravado in the streets and, kind of try to lord it over folks from the Fiji military. But, the truth is that the Fiji military is growing at a faster rate. And actually the British Army, was it earlier, no, in 2014, quite recently, started laying off military personnel, and 90 Fijians lost their jobs in a British Army kind of culling, you know, and so you start to see how vulnerable you are, you know, as labor, as militarized labor, whereas it looks like under this regime, Fiji military is just gonna keep growing. So, hi, Jessica.
So, my name is Jessica. I work at the consortium, and I echo everybody's enthusiasm for this, and I could just ask a million questions. My question that I'd like to ask now has to do, because you've talked on a number of occasions about the economics of this in terms of the household level and the pragmatism in deciding to join the military as a livelihood option. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more at the global level and some of the international arrangements that are creating what it sounds like incentives for having a more militarized population than other would. So I'm more curious about the Fijian army and their source of funding and how that relates to the peacekeeping missions and the economics of it all.
Yeah. Well, the peacekeeping, so apart from individual soldiers, you know, earning extra income, then the Fiji government gets a contract, gets a payment as well from the United Nations. And in the 1990s, there was a huge scandal because Fiji had been serving in Lebanon and in the Sinai, well, in the Lebanon since 1978, in the Sinai since 1982, and the UN was behind in its payments to Fiji. The soldiers were getting their money, but Fiji wasn't getting their money, and so Fiji had to kind of petition the UN to sort out its accounts. I don't think that's been a problem since then, but so the foreign revenue earnings for Fiji are valuable, yeah, and especially when Fiji keeps having coups and you know, having to kind of shift who they're trading with. This has been a constant, right? And Australia and New Zealand, when Fiji had this last coup in 2006, tried to put pressure on the United Nations to stop taking Fiji soldiers. And you know, I'm committed to demilitarizing, but I think that it's really important to demilitarize when you've got options, because you don't want an unemployed but highly trained, militarized, unemployed labor force, right? So, so at a global level, it's really important for Fiji. But the British Army and the private security are also really important release valves as well, yeah? So they pick up that labor, well, the British Army not so much. You don't get much crossover from the Fiji military to the British Army. There are a few cases, but most people who are in the Fiji military stay in the Fiji military, and the people that the British Army are recruiting, for the most part, are new, yeah, to soldiering. But in the private security, that's where you get the kind of the demobilized, the retirees, or the what do you call them? Reserves, or the, you know, the I've forgotten the word. So the other thing I wanted to mention was that the level of the growth of the Fiji military is from a global accounting perspective. The United Nations and the European Union changed their system of accounting in 2008 and 2009, so that military spending could now be appear on your national accounts as an asset rather than an expense. So it makes sense for Papua New Guinea and Fiji, who have the largest militaries in the Pacific Islands, to grow their militaries, because now the way you you calculate your GDP, you know, rewards militarization rather than kind of penalizing it. So I don't think we're going to see, of the 24 or so countries in the world with no militaries, I think half of them are in the Pacific. I don't think we're going to see new militaries forming, but the ones that are there now have the incentive to grow. But as I said in the beginning, this is all part of the new sort of economic boom for the Pacific is around resource extraction. And I didn't name it explicitly, but you know, we tend to focus on terrestrial mining, but what the Law of the Sea Convention does is that it gives these islands enormous tracts of seabed, yeah? And so the new frontier of mining globally is seabed mining, deep sea mining, yeah? Deep seabed mining. And so the Cook Islands here is one of the countries that's kind of ready to go on seabed mining. And they're looking for minerals like manganese, and it's, you know, it's the sort of mining that, as far as we know, isn't taking place in rim countries. And a lot of it is experimental. You know, I mean, it's like, it's not bad enough that the Pacific went through, you know, almost 50 years of nuclear testing, atomic testing and nuclear testing. Now they want to mine the seabed, yeah? And science shows that the seabed is very slow to recover, very slow to recover. So, you know, you just, even a shoe print in the deep seabed from 20 years ago is still there, because the water doesn't move down there, yeah? It's really, really still. So any mining that they'll do in the seabed is, you know, potentially, you know, there's potential for catastrophe, but these are the calculuses that our countries are making, right? If you can't export your labor, exploit your natural resources. And, you know, the Cook Islands has already exported most of its population to New Zealand. So there are only 15,000 in the Cook Islands, and there's something like 60, 70,000 in New Zealand, yeah? And that was an effect of structural adjustment. And so yeah, we're really looking at some kind of grim times. But mining is huge in Fiji, terrestrial mining. Haven't yet had any confirmations of seabed mining, but terrestrial mining is huge. China's a big player in the mining, and the militaries, they're kind of helping them, helping protect the mines, and, you know, facilitating things for these companies. So and as I said, there's a lot of trade between Papua New Guinea and Fiji, and so it's good. It's really important to watch, and mining and militarization definitely you know, going hand in hand. So.
Also the private security companies?
Yes, private security, huge in Papua New Guinea, you know, for all their mines. I mean, ironically, some of the private securities even doing the work that the police are afraid to do. Private security is doing call-outs for domestic violence. Yeah, so we've got really kind of, you know, upside down, like things that you wouldn't expect taking place. So gender, like for our gender analysis in the Pacific, we're really having to be very nimble, very agile, and the people who appear to be your friends might not be your friends, but they look like your friends, you know. So, yes, Rajni.
Rajni, yeah. You mentioned, well, I want to go back to the peacekeeping forces, and I know that, certainly during 1994, during the Rwandan genocide, the peacekeeping forces were seen as being placed in a very vulnerable position, and I know more recently, because places like Pakistan also send forces for peacekeeping, they have complained about their men and women being sort of put in harm's way in these dangerous zones. And though you mentioned that peacekeeping brings back to the government of Fiji considerable amounts of money, whether there's been any kind of questioning about the safety of the peacekeeping forces who are sent to these rather volatile regions.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been some questioning, but, you know, it's kind of tied back up with the heroic thing. Like, it's something I've been kind of ruminating on, but haven't gotten any clarity about yet. You know, I don't know if you recall the 45 Fijians who were taken hostage by a group in Syria. You know, there was a Filipino group that had also been taken attempted to be included in that, but they escaped, and the Fijians stayed, and it's a very mysterious set of circumstances, but the opposition in Fiji, a small number of civil society groups have, you know, expressed dismay at the government's willingness to send peacekeepers to Syria. But there's also this kind of pressure to save face. Like, Fiji has this enormous legacy of bravery. Why would we shy away from the worst humanitarian crisis ever? Yeah? We should feel proud to be selected to serve. So there is the critiques are muted, and, you know, yeah, there's I can't wait to be able to give some time to thinking about what happened there in that hostage situation. Because, you know, there are competing masculinities. Fijians would be offended if anyone implied that the Filipinos were better soldiers than them for escaping. Yeah. And I also think there's a kind of there's potential in there to think about a turning, because this was a you know, militant Islamic group, and the Fijians were, from what I've seen on YouTube, kind of willing to listen, yeah, And that's a different narrative from the normal kind of Sinai kind of where we think that Israel is the Israelites, right? So yeah, but I haven't seen anyone kind of analyze that at all in a way that doesn't involve conspiracy theories about, you know, billionaires kind of paying big dollars to keep the Fijians safe or something. Yeah. So, yeah. But really, yeah, we don't tend to in Fiji. You know, there's some there's some reliable spokespeople who challenge the military, and you kind of expect them to do it, and very few others. And certainly military families wouldn't, yeah? But there was one case in 2006 when a British Army, a soldier who was from Fiji, was killed, also in Helmand province, and 3 of his sisters signed a military families against the war petition. And that's the first and only time I've ever seen a military family in Fiji take a stand against the war. But they joined a British movement. This was not a Fiji movement. They joined a British movement, and they spoke out against the war, and they said, withdraw the troops. And it was quite remarkable. It has not happened since then. I don't know. It's really, there's 3 sisters, you know. Like, if there was 1 sister, that would have been amazing, but 3 of them came out and they said, this war makes no sense. Bring the troops home. So, very, very rare occasions of speaking out. And it's usually the women's groups who do speak out. But that also doesn't prevent them from working with the military when they have to on issues of family violence or, you know, dealing with post-traumatic stress, stuff like that. So they're navigating, you know, kind of tricky territory where they have to maintain a clear line, but also try to help where, you know, where their help is useful. So.
How should I say? You know, it's like people from countries such as Fiji and Pakistan and India get selected to be on these, or the Philippines get selected to be on these peacekeeping missions because they can then, it can be like a peacekeeping mission run on the cheap, you know, where people are not adequately equipped to counter the forces that might be in operation there. Because that was the principal argument in 1994 when, you know, what's his name, Romeo Dallaire had just sort of a ragtag peacekeeping force with nothing to protect them and nothing to intervene. And so I'm wondering if that gets brought up at all.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't explicitly investigated it, but it seems like in the 1990s, that's when it was rife, right? And there were huge stories in the Fiji media in post-1994, 94 and on, which were just, you know, sensationalizing the lack of equipment, the lack of adequate, you know, clothing even, kit, So I think the post-9/11 environment is really different, and that the UN and the US have tried to make sure that the peacekeepers are better equipped. Of the independent countries in the Pacific that have militaries, Fiji, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, and Vanuatu has a sort of kind of paramilitary police But Tonga is really interesting because, you know, Tonga joined the Coalition of the Willing. And one of the things that I heard from, I do a few lectures at the military college, the Army Staff College in New Zealand. And what I heard from them was that Tonga had better kit than New Zealand, because as a reward for joining the Coalition of the Willing, and of course Tonga's military is small, yeah? It's like a couple of hundred. The US could just drop a few dollars and they went into the space age, right? Their kit was so good, the New Zealanders were envious, yeah? So, and of course now Tonga and Papua New Guinea have been kind of getting involved more in international service, yeah? But I would imagine, I didn't hear from the women in terms of any complaints about kit. And I think their friends in Asia are looking after them in terms of kit, you know, updating kit. But yeah, that's it. We talked sort of vaguely about personal weapons and, you know, things, but it wasn't a big focus. But that's what I understand, is that, you know, it has not been an issue in recent years. But yeah, you're right about, you know, the kind of graduated labor, right, and racialized labor hierarchies. That's much more evident, I think, in private security. People talk about it much more freely. I think with peacekeeping, you know, Fijians would be embarrassed. You know, it goes back to the conflict with the Indians. They'd be embarrassed if at the idea that they were being paid less. They'd rather not know. They're grateful for what they've got, and let's get on with the work. Yeah. So yeah.
Yes. So I want to. First of all, thank you for making sure that none of us will ever see a world map in the same way again. And secondly, for really putting these Pacific Island countries in our world maps in a way that I think is not new for everyone in the room, but certainly for many of us. And then for really stimulating and complicating our thoughts about the relationships between gender, militarization, national economies, global political relationships, and religion, and all together just obviously giving so many of us so many rich things to think about. Really, thank you so much for coming and sharing.
Thank you for having me.